It is the 2000th anniversary of the death of Livy, and so of course, in my view, it needs to be commemorated. I mentioned that to another great friend here, Leandro Polverini, and he waved his hand and said, "Oh, but the fascists did all that in the 1930s. Well, no, I don't buy that for a second. It's a lot of anniversaries actually this year. It's the 200th anniversary of the birth of Theodore Mommsen, the greatest Roman historian who ever was and ever will be. And it's the 300th anniversary of the birth of Johannes Winckelmann, the founder of art history for the ancient world. So we celebrate quite a few things. Ronald Syme magisterially pronounced about Livy, quote, "Not much material for a biographer." Well, Ronald Syme is one of my great heroes, but I'm afraid in this particular matter he was completely wrong. Even Homer nods. If you look up Palivasova, the great classical encyclopedia, you'll find the biographical details on Livy occupy less than one column. So we start at the beginning, of course. We start with first things, dates of birth and death. One of the troubles about Livy is, I'll put my cards on the table right here and now, I can't think of any literary figure who has been more badly treated than Livy, anywhere, anytime. Really, the scholarship on Livy is, in my view, a total disgrace, because it's handled by people who are not historians. They're philologists, they're archaeologists, they're art historians, and so on. Now, I'm not a philologist, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not an art historian, and so in those fields I have to go to the experts. I've spent all my life not in classical studies departments, but in historical departments, and that's where I learnt about history, and I thank my lucky stars that I had that training. So I'm afraid there have been so many. I've given you 4 or 5 texts there. We're going to talk about them. You'll see just how badly they've been treated, people who can't even read Latin. So we start at the beginning with Livy's dates of birth and death. And according to the late 4th, early 5th century authority Jerome of Aquileia, who wrote a chronicle, famous chronicle, Livy was born in 59 BC, which is a wonderful date because it's Caesar's first consulship. And Caesar is the man who 10 years later, in 49, will give citizenship to the Transpadane Gauls, and Livy was born in Batavium. So at the age of 10, he became a Roman citizen thanks to Caesar. And he was born in Caesar's first consulship. That cheers me. But Syme in particular started in 1958 to say this date is not reliable, because Jerome connects Livy with Valerius Messala, who was a leading figure of the early Augustan Principate, and he can't be born in 59. According to modern adjustments, no source tells us this, it's modern adjustments. What we know about Valerius Messala later suggests to some people he couldn't have been born as late as 59 because he'd be too young, be doing the things he did in the 30s and 20s and so on. So they suggest that they move his date back 5 years, Valerius Messala, move him back from 59 to 64. And in that case, said Syme, Livy has to go too, because Jerome was working on synchronisms. Well, I'm not moving Livy because, as I say, the date of Valerius Messala is not something fixed. It's something that's been created by modern historians. And then a year later, that's 58, a year later, 1959, Syme suggested that the date of Livy's death in Jerome, AD 17, should also be moved back, because he said, Jerome, where did Syme get all this stuff from? Because he said Jerome worked on longevity, worked on the time of a person's life, the years. And Livy, according to him, was 76. So if you move his birth back 5 years, you have to move his death back 5 years. Well, Ronald Syme didn't seem to realise that he talked about synchronisms. Eusebius says that Livy died in AD 17 the same year as Ovid. And everyone accepts that Ovid died in 18 AD 18. 17. Everyone accepts that. So you can't play ducks and drakes with these things. And indeed, in recent years, people have come back to say, look, let's not start all this nonsense, let's keep things where they were. It's more likely that Jerome was right than wrong. There's, of course, a chance he was wrong, of course, but not enough to make us change everything. Ernst Bading used to joke with me all the time about how the pusillanimous editors of the Oxford Classical Dictionary caved in to Syme, and they still record the alternative dates, even in the third corrected edition. Livy was born in Patavium in Cisalpine Gaul, not far from Venice. Something we can straight away say about him, this is not to do with his life, it's to do with his ideas, but we'll have to say something about that as we go along, is that in the surviving 1/4 of his history, 35 books out of 142, exactly 1/4. In the surviving quarter of his history, Livy mentions his own important city twice. In Book 10, Chapter 2, and in Book 41, Chapter 27. Book 41, Chapter 27. So what we can say about Livy straight away is he wasn't guilty of what the Italians call capitalismo. In other words, he wasn't blowing the trumpet of his own city, as important as it was. He came from the family of the Livii, and that has suggested to people rightly the great Friedrich Münzer, whom you can now all read in English, thanks to my wife's translation. The great Friedrich Münzer says he was connected with the more famous plebeian aristocratic family of the Livii, with their various families, the Salernatores and so on, in Rome. They were in fact a Latin aristocratic family from Latium, but they had strong connections with northern Italy. So, connection with the Livii. As for his family, we have pretty good circumstantial evidence. Now, one of the things historians have to do all the time is rank the status of the evidence. Sometimes we have definite statements, as I've just told you, from Eusebius. Other times we have, on the scale, we have certainty, then we have probability, and then we have possibility. You've got to be aware of that. The great probability, which we can argue from the nature of his life, that he was able to spend his life writing history, this means he was a man of means. This means probably his family was well off. And the nature of his education suggests that too. I think we can say the strong level of probability, his family was well off, given his education and given the way he spent his life. Now, we don't have him referring, although we do have sometimes his referral to events of his life. I'll give you an example in just a minute. But surely, one thing you can do to put Livy in context is make a list of important dates which are part of his life. For example, as I said to you, we'll come to it in a minute, at the age of 6, Crassus died in Parthia, the Battle of Carrhae. Livy was 6. He would have told about that, of course, in the later books of his history. He was 10 when the civil war between Caesar and Pompey broke out. He was 11 at the Battle of Pharsalus. More about that in just a moment. And the death of Pompey. He was 15 when Caesar was assassinated. He was 16 when the triumvirate was formed between Antony, Lepidus and Octavian, which was bound to have effect on his life, as I'll show you in a minute. He was 17 when the Battle of Philippi, or the battles, plural, were fought. And he was 28 when the Battle of Actium was fought. Now there is one event out of all that about which we know something because it features as a fragment of his history. It's recorded by Plutarch in his Life of Caesar, chapter 47. In 48, as the Battle of Pharsalus was being fought, a priest at Patavium, a man called Cornelius, was conducting augural observations or augural predictions. And as he was doing that, he suddenly cried out, as though inspired, "Caesar, you are victorious," and tore the wreath from his head. And the way it's told, Livy was there. So at the age of 11, he was in Patavium when the news came through, or when this seer correctly foretold the outcome of the battle between Caesar and Pompey. And he would have put that into his history 50 years later. His education, well, he must have been educated at Batavium. I don't think there's the slightest doubt about that. There's no point in sending him to Rome. Batavium could educate him perfectly properly. And we know exactly what he was educated in. Latin and Greek for a start, of course, the languages. And I make a point about that because there have been people so cruel and so ignorant as to suggest that Livy did not know Greek. Patrick Walsh, the author of the worst book ever written about Livy, had an article in 1958 called Livy's Howlers, in which he managed to find a couple of places where Livy had made a slip in translating from Polybius, and so said he didn't know Greek. Ridiculous, totally ridiculous. Apart from that, in subjects, he was educated in rhetoric and philosophy. And we have a pretty good idea, pretty good guess, strong probability again, that one of his teachers was a man called Miltiades, because Seneca the Elder quotes Livy referring to him as a teacher who condemned obsolete and vulgar and obscure usages. Why would Livy single out this man? Because he'd been one of his own teachers. The obvious explanation. We also know from Seneca the Younger in his epistles, number 100, that Livy wrote dialogues which Seneca said were as easily assignable to philosophy as to history, so he was trained in philosophy as well. We know that he had from the history surviving books, that he had a predilection for Stoicism. But there's one aspect of his education which only one other person has ever noted. A Frenchman, Ernst Dutoit, in 1948, in Museum Helveticum. Tit livre, est-il intéressé à la médecine? That's the title of the article. Well, I can count in the existing surviving books 18 cases where Livy goes out of his way to draw a medical metaphor. What is the obvious conclusion to draw? That Livy was trained in medicine. And I'll go one step further with a suggestion, the possibility that he may at one stage early in his life have actually thought of becoming a doctor, and then gave it up and went into these other things, philosophy and history and so on. But he may well have been trained as a doctor. 18 cases is simply too many to be a fluke. Of course, when you have this kind of thing, I'll give you one example. He's talking about a plague in Syracuse, pestilence at Syracuse in 215 during a very hot autumn, and says that the people outside the city were even more affected than those within, and that one of the main dangers was looking after anyone who was sick because it was very contagious, and that one's normal human feelings were blunted, people became callous because people were dying all round them and so on, and that many people committed suicide. What is the resort of the Livy butchers? Well, the cry is topos, topos, meaning cliché, meaning even plagiarism. And in this case, it's Thucydides on the plague, book 2, he stole it all from Thucydides. No, he didn't. You compare the two accounts, totally different, totally different. So, a strong interest in medicine, sufficient for me to suggest that he had had some training in it. Then we come to one of the great assertions about Livy's whole life. Remember what I told you, that he was 10 when the civil war broke out between Pompey and Caesar, and 28 when the civil wars of Augustus' time ended. Between 10 and 28, during that, try to imagine what it must have been like living in the Roman world during this time of civil war with armies rampaging up and down. I did write many years ago about the economic horrors of these times, but the military horrors, one of the mantras of Livian study is that Livy never served in an army. Evidence, please? Evidence? Oh, well, because he's such a bad historian on military matters. He's such a poor recounter of battles. Oh, and why is he such a poor recounter of battles? Because he never served in an army. Round and round we go. Completely oblivious, reality check is one of the tricks historians have. Ask any military historian, what is the most tricky thing in writing military history? sorting out the accounts of the people who actually took part. And why is that? Because every single soldier in a battle can see about one person on either side of himself. Even generals can't make sense of battles. So the idea that Livy never served in an army simply because he can't tell the story about a battle in a way that we find acceptable is totally illogical. No evidence whatsoever. Indeed, I ask you to consider these things. Recruitment was endless and brutal across the whole Roman Empire for the course of these 20 years. It would have been impossible, I suggest, for any able-bodied man in his adolescence and 20s to have escaped conscription. Livy would have been recruitable from about 44 when he turned 15. And just consider these statistics. At Pharsalus in 48, some 20 legions were opposed to each other, about even on both sides. By the time of the formation of the triumvirate in 43, the three men had 40 legions among them. At Philippi, the total legions were something like 60. At Actium, even more, because Octavian ended up at the end of the civil wars in command of 70 legions. That's something like 350,000 men. Would it be possible for any able-bodied man to escape conscription? Ah, yes, you say. Yes, it would be possible. He could buy himself off. Yes, of course. In all times like that, there have been people of means who have paid to escape or to provide a substitute. But I think in these civil wars, there you are with your piece of paper, and next minute the front door is being hammered down and the recruiting officers are there, and you're saying, oh, but I paid. They said, throw it away, you're coming with us. So it seems to me there's only one out for this, only one suggestion, just a suggestion again, that Livy may have had some mild physical disability. In a modern army, you won't be allowed to serve if you have flat feet, but I don't think the Roman recruiters were as genteel as that. No one, of course, says that Livy suffered any physical disability, but that's my answer if you really want to save him from ever serving in an army when he was at prime recruitable age during the civil wars. Certainly the nature of his accounts of battles has nothing to do with it. At some time, Livy married. We don't know when, but if you will turn to the last of the texts, the four texts that I've given you, you will see what purports to be his tombstone, which we have in Padua. And there you have the tomb he set up, accepted by many people. Titus Livius, Guy Filius, son of Gaius, Sibi et Suis, the tomb he built, that is, for himself and his family. And clearly then the next two names are his sons, because they're both Titi Filii. Titus Livius, named after his father, with the surname Priscus. Livy didn't have a surname, but his sons do. Priscus, you can see he doesn't have a surname. Look at the first line. No trouble about that. Titus Livius Priscus and Titus Livius Longus, and something of great importance, it's also for Cassia Prima, the daughter of Sextus, his wife. So he married into the family of the Cassii. Yes, the assassin of Caesar, Cassius. They came from Patavium. He was connected with the famous family of the Cassii. And something more, one of his sons, so Seneca the elder tells us, his daughter. His daughter, that is Livia, she's not mentioned there, she married an orator called Margius. And guess what? Virgil's mother came from that family. Would we be surprised? Of course Virgil and Livy knew each other. And Virgil came from Mantua, up the north. A connection with the Cassii, a connection with the Margii. Two very important connections we can deduce from that. Then, similar connections in his mature life. What was happening while Livy was at the end of the civil wars? He was 32 when the so-called First Settlement, a totally modern term we have for what happened in 27 BC with Octavian taking the name Augustus and making his first attempt to sort out the constitutional crisis that he'd created, the chaos he'd created. It was an ongoing thing through his life, trying to make adjustments to that. While Livy was in his 30s, Virgil was composing the Aeneid, and of course Livy himself was writing, as I'll tell you in a minute. Livy was 36 when the Second Settlement came, in 23, when Augustus gave up the consulship, was creating too much trouble, monopolising an office that was only had 2 places anyway. Livy was 40 in 19 BC when he lost his friend Virgil. He was 46 when a very bizarre event occurred. The Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman cult, who had been in exile since 36 BC, Lepidus, died in exile. I wrote about that a long time ago. That's one of the most bizarre events of the Augustan regime. He was 47 in 12 BC when Agrippa died. Dionysius of Halicarnassus published his history in about 10 BC when Livy was 49. In 8 BC, when Livy was 51, Maecenas and Horace died. So, lots of things happening, and we can link Livy with all of them. So, his arrival in Rome, he was educated in Patavium, his arrival in Rome. There is a big argument, of course, about where Livy spent his life. Syme declared magisterially that there was no need for him to come to Rome. All the books he needed could be found in the local libraries at Patavium. Well, yes, I suppose that's true. It makes sense. Patavium would have had good libraries. Whether Livy could find all the old annalists that he wanted, I'm not sure. But, quite a bit. But I have a piece of evidence that I think counts for more than that, more than these assumptions. In the paper I gave for the celebration of Lucas Kotz's death, that day of study, that wonderful day we had here at the school a few years ago, I gave a paper on Livy in the topography of Rome. I have to tell you that the topography of Rome is an extremely complicated thing. But Livy, almost every time he mentions a building, tells you where it is. What is the conclusion we draw? That he knew the city intimately. The man who knew the city of Rome intimately had not spent his life at Patavium. Bang. There it is. There's the evidence. And wouldn't that be the place more naturally for him to come to work? If he's writing Roman history, think, once again, reality check. Think about the Roman history that he wrote. He's a total outsider from the people he's writing about. Comes from a middle class in the far corner of Italy. And he's writing an intimate history of the Roman aristocracy. He actually gets it almost always right. But I think the best place to have ensured that would be to be in Rome, so that if he's got any number of Cornelii rocketing round, he can actually go to someone and say, look, have I got the right Cornelius? Can you help me? Even consult the people of the family. It's not a history you'd want to write apart from, living sources that you could consult. But having said that I think there's clear evidence that he lived most of his life in Rome when he was writing the history, something quite contrary to that has to be stated. Livy in Rome was totally isolated. As Syme said in his 1959 article on Livy and Augustus, nothing connects him with any of the great senatorial patrons. The circle of Maecenas knew him not. His figure working in isolation. As I said, he knows people like Virgil and undoubtedly knows Ovid and Horace, but he doesn't belong to these patronised circles. He hasn't got official patronage. He's working as an independent scholar. Syme is certainly right about that. Now, beginning to write the history. This is the single most important event in his life, starting to write the history that will take him the rest of his life. There are two schools of thought, of course. When did Livy begin? Well, the majority of scholars, it must be admitted, not that counting heads is any use to an historian, but I just mention as a fact, most people are happy to say that Livy would have started writing, say, well, certainly after Actium, 31, perhaps after a formal end of the civil wars, which of course is the Triple Triumph in 29 BC, maybe even as late, some people have suggested, as 27. On the other hand, there have been a number of very intuitive scholars who think about the reality again, including people I have great respect for, like Stephen Oakley, the author of that monumental commentary on books 6 to 10, one of the great works of modern classical scholarship. And James Luce, who wrote the best single monograph on Livy, suggestions that Livy was well underway in the late 30s. Once again, evidence. Do we have evidence? Yes, we do. And most people don't know of it. The evidence is in Book 4, Chapter 20, which we're going to be talking about in just a minute. Livy has already reached that point in Book 4 in the year 28 BC. Now I ask you, if you're starting a history on the scale of Livy, you're going to start with the foundation of Rome, ab urbe condita, and you're going to go down to your own time. It's a mere 7 centuries, nothing really. Going to go down to your own time, how long will it take for you to think about what you're going to do, plan the work, start to look at your sources, which are many and varied and complicated, all those early analysts, and believe me, he read them. That's another libel against Livy, that he hadn't read the earlier analysts and was relying upon just a couple of the worst of his most immediate successors, like Aeneas Mesa and Valerius Antius. Total lie. He knew Fabius Pictor. He knew Cato. He had read them. He knew Ennius and so on. History in verse. How long would it take to actually think about this, to plan it all, to start reading, taking notes, and be down to Book 4 by 28? And once again, there's a great help that historians have, and that is comparisons. You don't have to treat everything in isolation. What about something similar? Well, I hope all of you know that reputedly Edward Gibbon had his great brainwave on the steps of the Capitol in 1764. The first volume of his history, The Decline and Fall, came out in 1776, 12 years later, the first of the 6 volumes. And by the way, it's half the length of Livy's total of the 142 books. Livy's total is about 2 million words, it would have been, and Gibbon wrote about 1 million. 12 years to do the first volume, and Gibbon was no fool. Equally important, of course, is the date when Livy proposed to finish. How far was the history to go? The fantasies of the moderns are really incredible. Just all guesswork, including one I'm sure you'll like. Down to 43, well, just down to the first, just after the death of Caesar, just after the murder of Caesar. That would take 120 books, so Anthony Woodman suggested. Syme said, well, maybe to Actium. 133 books would get him there. Or, as the great editors of the main edition of Livy, Weissenborn Müller, suggested, perhaps to the death of Augustus. Syme's unforgettable verdict about that. Quote, a high expectation of life might, it is true, been conceded to a studious citizen of Batavium, an exemplar of the regular habits which conferred so wide a notoriety upon that virtuous municipium, and no contemporary in his wildest hopes or fears could fancy that the heir of Caesar, fragile and often ill, would live on and on. But that would be frivolous argumentation. You see, the idea that Livy said, I'm going to write to the death of Augustus. Excuse me, how are you sure that he's going to die before you, and that if he does, you'll still have time to carry the history down to his death? You see straight away it's a house of cards that just collapses. Madness, madness. And so what we are told is that the 142 books, which also breaks the rule of pentads and decads, groups of 5 and 10 books, that's another piece of madness. The books we have are arranged in fives and tens. And then people say, with that evidence in front of them, oh, the non-surviving books couldn't have been organised in fives and tens. The evidence in front of you, the books we have, says fives and tens, and then you say, but the books we don't have, I'm just going to assert that they couldn't be organised in fives and tens. So, 142 books is a bit of an anomaly, given the arrangement. But here we go. Relations with Augustus. Hearing Augustus in 28. That's the first text. This is book 4, chapter 20. I said I'd bring you back to it. So let's all look there. It's one of the most, it is the most maltreated, misunderstood of all the chapters of the surviving 35 books. Believe me. It's a very, very complicated sentence. In fact, you can see that this sentence I'm talking about is the last, 6 lines. 6 lines. He says, it's so complicated, I'm not sure I'm going to get it right. He says that Augustus Caesar, it's accusative infinitive, that Augustus Caesar, I heard, audissem, 3 lines from the bottom, audissem, I heard that Augustus Caesar, further up, se ipsum himself, in thorace linteo, on the linen breastplate, legasse scriptum, had read what was written. Have a look at Foster's translation in the Loeb Library. Having heard from the lips of Augustus Caesar that he himself read the inscription, tell me, where are the lips? Where are the lips? If it wanted to say that, Latin is perfectly capable of saying, I heard Augustus Caesar se ipsum mihi dixisse, he told me. He doesn't say that. He says that he heard that Augustus had said. It's a bizarre way of expressing things. And so what the moderns make of it is, for example, Wilhelmovitz-Mühlendorf suggests that this shows Augustus' participation in the writing of Livy's history. Good God. Or that Hippolyte Taine, who wrote the first modern monograph on Livy in 1874, Augustus, quote, was his friend. One day he brought him the inscription on the linen breastplate. Where's that in the Latin? Or Walsh, as he was composing Book 4, Augustus, quote, took the trouble to ensure that the historian was informed of an alleged archaeological discovery. No such thing. As Badian said, there is no evidence whatsoever for any personal communication between Princeps and historian. Livy heard that Augustus had said somewhere, and Badian said, well, where? Well, the most obvious place for Augustus to have said it was in the Senate. But Livy wasn't a senator. He could not have heard it there. Badian actually suggested at an informal meeting in the form, a contio, as we call it, contio. There is no evidence for any personal relationship between Augustus and Livy here, but it has been an absolute linchpin for all people who want to talk about that. All people who believe, in other words, that Livy as an historian was a toady of the regime, and I wrote against that some couple of years ago. I went through the whole surviving 35 books and collected all the Augustan references, and believe me, some of them would have made Augustus' hair stand on end. Well, when was this episode supposedly taking place and what was going on? People have thought that it's perhaps in, say, 31, that that Augustus is restoring the temple of Jupiter Feretrius on the Capitol, where generals who had won this it's like a VC, you had to kill the enemy general in battle. And usually it was thought that you had to be the Roman general killing the enemy general. Well, that was Augustus' interpretation. But, as Livy says, Cornelius Cossus was simply a military tribune. He wasn't the commander-in-chief of the Roman army, and yet he got the spolia opima. When was all this happening? Well, the restoration of the temple is told to us by Cornelius Nepos, in his Life of Atticus, that it was Atticus, Cicero's great friend, who suggested to Augustus he should restore this little temple. It's only a very small temple. Nothing of it survives. And Atticus committed suicide in 32. So it's suggested by most moderns that means Augustus had to start restoring the temple the very next year. I'm sorry, Augustus was at Actium in 31. He wasn't restoring temples in Rome. What was the date? The date was 28. Why? Because Crassus, a young descendant of the old famous Crassus, who had been governor of Macedonia, came back to Rome and said, I've killed the enemy general in battle, I want the spolia opima. And Augustus had to start becoming an archaeologist, very smartly, excavating in the temple, supposedly finding a linen breastplate, and saying, oh no. He didn't win it when he was only military tribune. It was 10 years later when he was consul. And as Livy says, that's funny. All previous historians mention that he was only military tribune, you see. And Livy refused to change his story. Livy is reduced by all his enemies who say, what a toady he was, what a coward he was. He gave in when Augustus came with the linen breastplate. He never saw the linen breastplate, and he never gave in. He did not change. He says, anyone can make up their own minds. I'm just telling you. All the other historians have said this. Augustus says that. I leave it to you. More about his relations with Augustus in a moment. Oh, the other thing is that text is used also to abuse Livy by those who say that Livy never properly used sources, that Livy himself never followed up the breastplate. Once again, reality check. Do you mean Titus Livius comes to Augustus and says, excuse me, Imperator Caesar, but could I just have a look I'm not sure I understand or believe what you've said, could I just have a look at the linen breastplate for myself and make sure what you're saying is correct? What world do these people live in? He would have lost his head. No, he couldn't look at the linen breastplate. It wasn't being shown to him. Augustus is saying, I've got the breastplate, and what it says is that he was consul. No one else saw it. No one else. So, relations with Augustus are very important. But at this early time, he's just starting to write his history. There's a very interesting source we have. Probably none of you have ever used it. I don't wish it upon you that you have to use it. It's a 10th century lexicon, Greek lexicon, called the Suda or the Suidus. That's not the author's name, that's the name of the book. And under Cornutus, spelt with a kappa, of course, Suidus says this, the Suidus. Cornutus. There were two Roman historians, Livy, whose name is spread later with great repute and celebrity, and Cornutus, who I understand was rich and had no children, but otherwise had no real excellence. So great, however, was the difference in the number of the audience in those listening to these two men, that as many as possible heard Cornutus, flocking to this man with all indulgence and approval, in the hope of inheritance, because he had no children. Far fewer heard Livy, but they were more useful people, both for their mental elegance and eloquence. In other words, when he was a young historian making his name, Livy gave public readings, just like every other Augustan figure. But that's only told to us by this 10th century Greek lexicon, which is not easy to read. No. Travels. What about Livy's travels? It would be a rash scholar who would assert that Livy travelled much. One example, of course, is uncontested because Livy tells us. He says that in 3856 that he went down near Naples to visit Scipio's tomb. Scipio Africanus, the great Scipio, a nice example of the way the Romans treated their greatest heroes, sent into exile after being dishonoured in the Senate. He walked out, of course. He refused to provide the account books. This is the man who defeats Hannibal. This is the man who goes with his brother to defeat Antiochus. And then they ask him to show his account books. He tears them up and walks out of Rome and dies in exile down south. Livy made a pilgrimage to his tomb. So he tells us, 3856. It's very likely, with his extensive knowledge of Campania and Naples, Capua and Nola and so on, even Croton, that he'd travelled widely in Italy. And so Syme said in 1958 that Livy had ever been outside Italy, there is no sign. The judgment of 1958 had to be reversed in 1959, when Syme said that perhaps he visited Athens in later life. Now, where would you expect a person like Livy to go if not Athens? Every literary figure went to Athens. And indeed, Paul Graindor in 1923 published an inscription found in Athens, and it's very fragmentary. There are only 3 words left, but are they good? Hebule Libyon, the council, Hebule, the council of the 500, Libyon, with a B, of course they spell them with a B, Livius is called by the Greek, and accusative. Almost certainly some honorary decree in Livy's favour. And they just call him Livy. The fact that he's just called Livy, who else could be called just Livy? This is the great historian. This is probably later in his life. And indeed, for those who have eyes to see, and that's always a great problem, look at 45:27. Livy writes at length about Athens. He says, quote, which has many notable sights. The Acropolis, the harbours, the walls joining the Piraeus to the city, the shipyards, the monuments of the great generals, the statues of gods and men, notable for every kind of material and technique. Tell me that's someone who hasn't been to Athens. Of course he has. His last years, again synchronisms, just to put him in the picture. When he was 63, Tiberius was adopted as the heir, the unwilling heir of Augustus, since he'd run out of all the other heirs he thought of before. AD 6, the great revolt of the Danubian provinces, he's aged 65. He's aged 67 in 8 when Ovid is banished, so if you don't think there are dangers for Augustan writers, you haven't thought about Ovid. AD 9, he's 68 when the greatest single military disaster of the Augustan regime wipes out 3 legions in Germany. And he's 73 when Augustus dies. He will survive him for 3 years. So, relations with the court. Carrying on what we know about Augustus and Livy. The second text, Tacitus Annals 434. Now, I'm very sorry, I just looked at this today and thought, my God, when I put this text and translation together, it must have been after a dinner at the British school. Because they're out of kilter, but the 2 things we want do correspond. This is the trial of the historian Cremutius Cordus in AD 25. And he says, it's section 3, which you can see, it's the end of the Latin quote, and the beginning of the English translation from Anthony Woodman's translation of the Annals. Titus Livius, quite brilliant as he is, this is what was said by Cremutius Cordus in his defence. He was accused of having spoken favourably of Brutus and Cassius, the murderers of Caesar. Titus Livius, quite brilliant as he is for eloquence and credibility, first of all elevated Gnaeus Pompeius with such praises that Augustus called him a Pompeian. But that was no obstacle to their friendship. Well, has that been seized upon? Has that been seized upon? Livy would have reached Pompey in about Book 112, in the early years AD, if we calculate roughly an even rate of production. So this has been used time and time again as evidence of close relationships, friendly relationships between Livy and Augustus. Yes, Livy and Augustus. But it is the very opposite of a statement of fact. Don't you know that when modern historians see something that comes from a speech in ancient history, they straight away throw up their hands in horror and say, oh my God, you can't believe a word of that. Speeches are invented. But no, in this case, speech is taken totally literally. And so we have people saying, for example, Bornek, who wrote a monograph on Livy in the 1930s, discussing the section talking about Augustus, l'empereur en riant, the emperor laughing, says to Livy, oh, but you're an old Pompey and I know that, but I don't hold it against you. Where's laughing in the text? Who spoke about laughter? This is a matter of life and death. Critias Cordus will have to commit suicide. Nothing to laugh about. What do we have here? Syme put his finger on it. He said, quote, Tacitus renders, or rather invents, this man's eloquent vindication of the historian's rights. In other words, the historian's rights to tell history as he sees it and not be worried about the regime. But no historian has ever not had to worry about a regime if that's what he lived under. Or as Badian explained, for once Badian and Syme are in agreement, it represents what was commonly thought about Livy in Tacitus' day, and perhaps in 25. No, I'll go further. What we have in this text is what Tacitus in the early 2nd century thought, that Cremutius Cordus thought in 25, about what Livy and Augustus thought. No evidence whatsoever. But of course it's one of the keystones for many people. And the irony is that this text, it's as if people said, when you come to there was no obstacle to their friendship, you mustn't read another word. Put the text away. Do not look at anything else. So, we fail to see something that is historical evidence. Here is an historical fact, but no one notes it. Go on. This very Cassius himself, this very Brutus, nowhere did he, that is Livy, name in the most bandits or parricides the designations now imposed. Latrones, Parakidas. We have here a fundamentally important insight into the Augustan regime. Every regime that comes to power after a civil war and establishes a monarchical system wants control of the history that goes before. They want control of that. And one of the things they want to impose are these pejorative descriptions of the old enemy. You know, you call them now in modern usage people like hooligans. Well, you can see here, Augustus wants Brutus and Cassius to be called robbers and parricides. And what does Tacitus tell us? He tells us, and it's right, as I'll show you in a second, he tells us that Livy refused to toe the line. Livy would not call them that. Well, I told you he was related to the Cassii. His wife came from the Cassius family. He refused to toe the line. But that's a fact. Why is it a fact? Because it's a statement about Livy's history that anyone in Tacitus' day could check. Tacitus says Livy refused to call Brutus and Cassius robbers and parricides. Anyone who said, wait a minute, just had to look up Livy's history and said, oh, yes, Tacitus wasn't making that up. That was a fact. That's where people don't want to go. We learn something more about Livy and his relationship with the regime. But in fact, there is the best evidence of all, which was produced by Luce in 1990, a brilliant article on Livy, Augustus, and the Forum of Augustus, in that marvellous book Between Republic and Empire, edited by Kurt Rauflaub and Toa. in which he compared the remains we have of the eulogies from the Augustan Forum with the statements made by Livy about these same men in his history, and they don't coincide. They don't coincide. In other words, Augustus set up an historical commission to draw up these eulogies, which would be placed under the statues of the great heroes of the past in the Augustan Forum. Livy was clearly not a member of that commission, and the commission took not the slightest notice of what Livy had said about these men in his history. Do you want better evidence of the relation between Livy and Augustus? Well, I as an historian know no better. There it is. And it's probably towards the end of his life, the third text we finally come to, again totally mangled, Suetonius' life of Claudius. Claudius began in his youth to write a history with the encouragement of Titus Livius and the direct help of Sulpicius Flavius. Hortante Tito Livio, Sulpicio vero Flavo adjuvante. Now, what do you make of that? Well, you wouldn't believe. What we have in a second is that Livy becomes a tutor to the young Claudius. Tutor. Some people say that in fact he became a living tutor. He even took up residence in the palace in order to help Claudius with his history. This text shows, quote, Walsh says, showed Livy's popularity at the imperial court. Of course, it shows nothing of any such thing. People can't read Latin. What does hortante mean? It means encouraging. Now, what would it mean? What would it mean actually in reality for Livy to encourage Claudius? His adolescens, so that means strictly speaking, between puer and juvenis, adolescence, something like that. Although it's one of the most treacherous words in the Latin language, because Cicero, at the age of 42, when he's consul, calls himself adolescens. Don't jump to conclusions about adolescens. But I think in this case, Claudius is young. It's his first historical work before he gets on to the really great stuff on the Carthaginians and the Etruscans and so on. So he's born in 10 BC, Claudius, so sometime in the first decade AD. Encouraging, what would it mean? Well, I think the most simple and obvious suggestion is that Claudius must have known Livy, must have been able to speak to him. Which side is the initiative been coming from? From Claudius, for sure. He's able to say to Livy, look, I want to write this history. It was a history of the late Republic, dangerous stuff. I want to write this history. Do you think I can, because he had suffered from disabilities of various kinds. Do you think I can do it? What would you say? And Livy said, yes, you go ahead, yes. He encouraged him. Nothing to do with tutoring. And indeed, once again, we're told, don't read another word. Hortante Tito Livio. Stop. Don't read Sulpicio vero Flavo etiam adjuvante. So out of Livy as the hortator and Sulpicius Flavus as the adjutor, if you want to use the word tutor, who do you think the tutor is? And of course, if you ask me then what do we know about Sulpicius Flavus, the answer is nothing apart from this. Historians have to deal with irony and frustration. Yes. And then one other great thing for the late Livy and his later history, we're told, although people have been desperate to throw it away, we're told at the beginning of the summary of Book 121 that this book was not published until after Augustus' death. Well, it wouldn't be just Book 121, it would be the last 20 books. Now, why would that be? What is Livy getting up to by the time he gets to Book 121? He's up to the triumvirate. You saw what he said about Brutus and Cassius? No, he says, I think we'd better put these aside for better days. Another piece of evidence about his relations with Augustus. There is, however, one wonderful story, presumably in his really later life, and that is the story told by Pliny the Younger, in his Natural History. In his letters. Pliny the Younger in his letters. Have you ever heard the story of the Spaniard from Gades? He was so stirred by the famous name of Livy that he came from his far corner of the earth to have one look at him and then returned home. This was the fame that Livy had in his late life. You can make light of that. Cruel people, for example, say, where did the story come from? Was it the Spaniard who told it, or was it Livy? See, indulging in cruelty for no real purpose. No, Livy was very famous, and that story illustrates it. So he died in AD 17 and was buried at Patavium, Padova, as we saw from the tombstone. Now, what should we call it? The Nachleben of Livy. The wonderful essay was written by Walter Ullmann in 1973, The Postmortem Adventures of Livy, in which he talked about these things. But, of course, the people of Patavium always knew that Livy was the most famous son, and in the late 13th century, a tomb inscription turned up mentioning a Livius. And people like Petrarch and Boccaccio, these very, very considerable people who really knew Latin like their mother tongue, as well as they knew Italian, were totally tricked by it. It wasn't Livy at all. It was a man called Livius Hallis, who was a freedman. He has a surname, Halys. It wasn't Livy, but they were taken in by it completely. It wasn't until 1413 that the inscription I've shown you there was found. And I'll just tell you one little story about that. That's my own photograph of it. And I'd be very surprised if anyone in this room ever got to see it. But years ago, my wife and I were in Patavium, in Padova, and I said to her, I've got to see this inscription that is probably, it's accepted by most people now. Paulivasova and so on. Klotz. I've got to see it. So we walked up and down the streets in the Palazzo Capitalista. Walked up and down the street, no sign of anything like a palace. And finally I said, look, here are two very old, very huge wooden doors in a very bad state of repair. That's the closest I can see to what might be a palace. Let's try. So I rang the bell. And after quite some time, a very, very nervous and worried middle-aged woman, clearly a servant, this family is still considerably important and rich, this woman came nervously to the door and it opened kind of enough for her to look out. She saw me there and I said, look, as I like to say on these occasions, I've crossed the world to see this thing. But it didn't cut any ice in this case. She looked at me and she was by herself and we weren't going to get in. And then Therese just stepped around me and a woman appeared, you see, and that showed that I wasn't a bandit, unlike Brutus and Cassius. And that I could be trusted, and the door opened, and there in front of us was a huge undercroft, wide enough for carriages to go in. Two big wooden doors would open, and a carriage could get in, and it led into an interior courtyard where the light was coming from. It was all very dim inside, and I said to Therese, I reckon we've got about 60 seconds to find this inscription. And there were benches, stone benches on either side, and in the gloom I started to be able to see things. I leapt up on the left-hand side and I looked, no, and I looked, no, and I looked, yes. That's the photograph I took. And then I said, take another photograph, and I stood up and I put my hand on the inscription. Now, that tombstone was set up, if it is Livy's, was set up for him and his family. So in his lifetime, Livy is likely to have handled that inscription. Livy is likely to have held that inscription in his hand. And I put my hand on it. These are the experiences only historians, they make your hair stand on. These are experiences only historians can have, and which makes me say that I didn't want to be a brain surgeon, I didn't want to fly a 747, I only ever wanted to be an historian, because the prizes you get are tremendous. And finally, the last image I've given you there of two men. I was talking to my good friend Robert Coates-Stevens just before we came in, and the question is, do we have a portrait of Livy? Do we have a portrait of Livy? I would give my right arm, as you can imagine, to have that. This comes from one of the most contested monuments of Rome, which of course is saying something. It's generally called the Ara Pietatis Augusti, the altar of Augustan piety, and it's frequently been thought to be a Claudian arch of some kind, or altar. But what date it is and what it shows, endless suggestions. It's Claudius' return from his expedition to Britain in 43, or it's to celebrate the deification of Livy, and so on, his grandmother. But in 1941, this relief is in the Villa Medici. It's one of those appalling behaviour of the French in pasting up onto the facade of their villa these wonderful reliefs and so on, all exposed to the weather. They've been there for centuries. This one came there in the 16th century. Rhys Carpenter was talking about in 1941 in the Memoirs of the American Academy, and said he thought that these three figures, there are three, and I've cut off the one on the right, were perhaps literary figures from the time of Augustus, who were known to Claudius and whom he wanted to honour. And the middle one, which is the figure on the right there, as you've got it, is very often taken to be a Virgil. So if that's the case, then the other two figures might well be literary figures. But Rhys Carpenter thought that this figure on the left was Propertius. Well, shortly after that, Vincenzo Scramuzza, who wrote one of the early biographies of Claudius, suggested rather that on a monument of Claudius, who would be an obvious choice? But somewhere Livy. And he thought perhaps the figure on the left was Livy. But that idea has sunk without a trace. I've been going through the more recent discussions of the monument and the reliefs and so on, and no one even refers to it slightingly. So, of course, we don't have a portrait of Tacitus either. Better off for the Greek historians. I'm told by the art experts we have pretty good portraits of Herodotus and Thucydides, but not of Roman figures. Of course, most of the early figures of the political life of the Republic we have no portraits of. No portraits of the Gracchi, or one of Scipio Africanus in the Capitoline Museum. Not terribly convincing. By the time you get to the late Republic, Marius, Sulla, and then on, that's okay. So what I want to leave you finally with is just one major observation, why this man has my great respect. He spent his whole life as an historian. He couldn't have done it in less than virtually his whole life. He produced 142 books, double the size of Gibbon's Decline and Fall. This is, I think, certainly in the classical world, the greatest historical enterprise undertaken. Just compare. Herodotus, we have all 9 books, and I'll put them in the Loeb Library for the sake of comparison. 4 volumes, Herodotus, in the Loeb Library. Thucydides, 4 books in the 4 volumes in the Loeb, but of course at the end of the Peloponnesian War is missing from 411. Say another volume, or even 2 if you like. Say 6. Tacitus, we have for the Annals and the Histories 4 volumes. There would have been at least another 1 or 2, so once again 5 or 6. If we had all of Livy, you would need 50 volumes. Thank you very much.